we'll get us started.
All right, I guess we're now officially recording. Welcome to everybody online and to everyone here to our adult forum. Our topic today is voter suppression in Colorado, and we thank in particular our guests and turn it over for introductions to Trinity.
Thank you, sir. I hope that I'm seeing everybody. I currently see Mr. Paul Lopez here, Denver Clerk and Recorder. Thank you so much, Mr. Lopez.
Thank you.
Am I missing Mr. Gruskin and Judd, maybe? Are we? Oh, there's Judd. Hello, sir.
Hey,
And
sorry,
I'm here as
everybody.
well.
That's all right.
Let me turn on my, there we go.
Hello.
Computer problems.
That's all right. We all deal with them. Welcome. We might still be waiting on Mr. Mark Gruskin, leading Colorado elections attorney.
So I'm here. And,
Oh, he's right there. Hello, sir. Wow, so many screens. Good morning. It's so lovely to have all three of you here. My name is Trinity Thomas. I'm a member of the racial equity team at First Plymouth. We are honored to have you guys here today. And as Sandy sort of already got us started, we as a racial equity team, specifically during Black History Month, wanted to focus on the topic of voter suppression, just knowing how much of a heated discussion it's been in recent elections. And I'll speak for myself when I say that, at least for me, it's tough to talk about primarily when I feel uninformed. And so we are grateful that you guys have joined us to sort of educate us on your expertise. And Mark was actually very helpful in communications leading up to today to divide up some questions that we had to sort of match each of your levels of education and expertise individually. So hopefully you guys are okay answering individual questions. But the biggest question for racial equity team leading into today was, what is the greatest threat to voter rights across the nation and in the state of Colorado, both for the state and local elections? And I think Mr. Gruskin was very helpful to break those down into sort of subtopics. And Mr. Gruskin, if you don't mind starting with yours, just in terms of general voter suppression tactics historically, and as it surfaces in Colorado in light of mail balloting and sort of your perspective on all of that, that would be great.
Thank you. I'm happy to jump in, understanding that you've got two experts coming up who in very real ways get their hands dirty with this 24/7, 365 days a year. So Clerk Lopez and Judge Choate honestly are substance experts in ways that I'm an election law lawyer. I've been doing this for a while, but I think you're going to get a lot of great information for them. I know you are. So I appreciate their willingness to participate today because I know they'll advance the conversation. And I thank you for granting for developing this audience, this issue. As an election law lawyer for the last 35 years, there's no issue that strikes closer to home for me. Before I begin talking about general voter suppression tactics and how this might rear its head in Colorado, I got to make three confessions. Number one, I'm a Democrat. I have been since day one. And even though I've got partisan stripes, I've also headed up nonpartisan efforts to make sure that the polls were open to every qualified voter that wanted to vote. So I've had my feet in partisan and nonpartisan buckets, but I didn't want there to be any misconception. Second confession, I love voting. I walked into my first polling booth with my mother at age 8 and watched her vote until she got to the bottom of the ballot. And she said, I don't know how to vote in this race. And I said, well, Dad and I talked about this, and here's what I would do. So ever since then, I've been voting. And the opportunity to make sure that everyone who can vote gets to vote is one of those uniquely rewarding exercises as a professional, and I'm sure that Clerk Lopez and Judge Choate share that second confession. My third confession isn't one that I thought I would ever have to make, which is I worry about the durability of our system of government in light of what has happened over the past few years in terms of casting doubt on the election integrity that is embedded in our system. And I say that because most of the doubts that have been raised and most of the challenges to voting that have been raised in recent years are raised based not on facts, but are raised based on issues that have potentially partisan advantage. And that is an abiding concern on my part, and the framework for which I've crafted these comments. So let me jump in. Number one, what are the historic impediments to voter registration as opposed to actual voting? Well, we're all familiar with literacy tests from the Jim Crow era, poll taxes. And even though those have gone by the wayside, there clearly was, in the wake of things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, intimidation of marginalized communities, racial communities, lower economic communities. And in Colorado doesn't exactly have, notwithstanding the fact that it really is a leader nationally today in terms of the very best election process that can be had, its own history is somewhat checkered. There were, in the early part of the 20th century, there were takeovers of the election apparatus by corporations in Southern Colorado, coal companies, mainly when they knew that they wanted an election result. And in very few instances have the Colorado courts invalidated elections, but that is one such instance. And so we've got our own less than ideal history. What are the challenges that are used to deter actual voting? And I'm going to talk generally here because I'm going to come back on this. There's misinformation. There can be misinformation about candidates' issue positions, about when an election is being held, about the location of and times for voting at precinct polling places, and even when a voter's arrival at a polling place qualifies him or her for voting. As we all know, if you're in line at 7 p.m., you can vote. But there have been efforts in the past, including in Colorado, to inform voters that if they're merely in line, that's not enough, and their vote won't count. And that is intended to disqualify those voters who vote late in the day. What's another challenge to deter voting? In my view, voter ID. Voter identification, having to provide some sort of picture evidence of voter identification is often sold as nothing more than the very same thing you'd have to do to get on board an airline or to cash a check. And in both of those instances, there are ample historical instances of either fraud or public danger or something else. The interesting thing about voter fraud is that it is bandied about as a threat to our system, but it is almost never proven. And frankly, those that are trying to clamp down on voting rights are the ones who are loudest about their concerns about voting fraud without being able to prove it. And so to the extent that photo ID is nothing more than an attempt to try and create one more hurdle before people get to vote and to prevent certain segments of the population from being able to vote, it's certainly been used that way. A third challenge to deter voting have been kind of the random challenges to voters at the polling place. There is a process whereby an individual may, at a polling place, challenge a voter based on the fact that there is a belief that individual is not qualified or is not who he or she says they are. But the effect is that in a community, the rumor spreads that your right to vote is being challenged right where you get to cast it. And that process has been used with some effect to keep people out of a polling place. There are oftentimes organized challenges to vote totals, either in the precincts or in the counting process, by election judges, by canvass boards, sometimes by election officials like county clerks themselves. And honestly, in 2020, what we saw was that Congress, in the presidential race, decided that it was in a position to challenge vote totals, notwithstanding the fact that it had no evidence that there was any reason to do so. There's a less direct way of challenging or deterring voting rights, and that's where voting sites are placed. Sometimes, if they are at an excessive distance from a population center, or there are only a few of them to service a great number of people. If they're placed at locations that are not otherwise community gathering centers and therefore are somewhat remote or arcane or difficult to get to, there are intimidating locations, like placing polling locations in the sheriff's office, where certain people are not going to want to necessarily walk into. And another issue that often comes up in terms of deterring voting is when there are lines, and oftentimes early and late in the day, the polling place locations, that's what happens. There is an effort to try and keep people in line, entertain them, give them water, give them a granola bar, or provide some sort of shade. And there is an effort, and there continues to be efforts in various states to try and make sure that those kinds of voter support activities that have nothing to do with the candidate, a party, a ballot issue, or request to vote in any certain way are denied. And I think Judd is going to talk about what's going on across the country. And he's got a tremendous overall sense. And Paul's going to talk about what happens within an election office to try and make voting more difficult. So I'm not going to displace their conversations, but just know that there is legislation that would address each of these issues in certain states and make them more difficult. Now, I keep saying certain states and not Colorado, because in 2013, as you all know, Colorado adopted its mail voting system. And so from the 2014 election cycle on, we have used mail balloting and refined it and advanced it. And I will say, because Judd is probably too modest to do so, that Colorado is the national model. There are states that are as good as Colorado, but there's no state that's better. And there's no state that's more trustworthy. And there's no state that's more practiced. And therefore, as you all know, based on your own experience of recent elections, you cast a vote in your living room or at your kitchen table at your leisure by filling out your ballot and dropping it in a mailbox, or you take it to a neighborhood drop box at your branch library, at one of a number of designated churches or community centers, or at governmental offices. And all you have to do is take that sealed, signed ballot and put it in a drop box in order for it to be aggregated by your county clerk and count. There obviously, it remains an option for in-person voting at county clerk designated sites. From that time that I was 8 years old, there was always some little switch that got flipped in me about voting on election day and voting in an election site, even if it wasn't a precinct site, a school, or someplace else in my neighborhood. I've gotten over that personal preference, but a lot of people still do that. And many times If you spoil your ballot, or if you didn't receive your ballot, you go to a designated site and you're able to vote in person there. One of the things that Colorado has adopted that has really made our system work so seamlessly is same-day voter registration. There are a lot of people who, for many years, took interest in the campaigns that were on the ballot too late to participate. And so, given Colorado's 30-day voter registration requirement, former requirement, they really couldn't participate. And yet it was anomalous that at the very time that campaigns were heating up and at the very time that issues were becoming ripe for decision, that people couldn't engage in that precursor of an act, voter registration. Well, as technology advanced and as counties were basically able to share voter registration information through the Secretary of State, it was clear that that same-day voter registration wouldn't be abused. And that is an important adjunct for a lot of voters to be able to engage substantively or around candidates and act as late as election day. And Judd's in a much better position to talk about how this voter-related information is coordinated to ensure integrity of registration and voting. One thing that's important to know is that a lot of the doubt that gets created about voting that gets used then to deter voters from actually exercising that franchise is a concern that somehow there is an internet connection that allows votes to be manipulated, changed, deleted, or whatever. And I can't go too far into that because my law firm's involved in some litigation in defending that process. But I can tell you, those claims that are being made have no factual basis. There's never been, in all of the challenges that surfaced in 2020, any proof at all that anyone's ballot was either deleted or changed, or if it should have been counted, not counted. But nonetheless, that creating fear, creating uncertainty is a tactic that is used to suppress votes. So what are the challenges that we face to either deter mail voting or neutralize it? Well, the same-day voter registration is often exercised by people who are new to the state and younger voters. And the threat is often made that students will lose their financial aid package if they register at a Colorado address. And it is, again, it's not the reality of the ultimate worry. It's just the threat that many times keeps people from registering. Secondly, even in a mail ballot situation, you have misinformation about how you can return your ballot or the time period required for ballot return. There are, and I have seen them in the past few cycles, there have been campaigns to say it's okay if you return your ballot by Wednesday, the day after the election. If you drop it in a drop box, or if it is delivered by someone who you have designated. And so that kind of misinformation really undermines the right to vote, obviously, and we have seen it and we continue to see it. Many times for those in-person voting sites that I made reference to, they are located at places, as I said, like in a sheriff's office, that isn't necessarily the governmental office that needs to be used in order to ensure security. And there is one county that almost habitually makes sure that there's a sheriff's car out in front of the in-person site. And there are certain deputies that like to run their lights while they are sitting out in front of a voting site. We have seen it before. County clerks have been terrific at trying to curb that activity. But needless to say, it is a deterrence, a matter of deterrence for certain communities who are walking up to a polling place. Literally within the last week, I've seen an article published in the Federalist and endorsed by the Republican National Lawyers Association that says that mail balloting and no excuse absentee balloting is always going to be suspect because of remote electioneering. Now, electioneering prohibitions apply to ensure that people who are within 100 feet of their precinct polling place aren't being told what to do or which campaigns to vote for or against. But remote electioneering is defined by this particular author and endorsed by the organization I mentioned as, and I quote, an attempt to influence or solicit votes among absentee voters between the time they receive their absentee ballot and the time they submit it to their election office. Well, it actually, if that's what people are worried about, it actually has a different definition. And that's what's known as campaigning or informing voters about the voting process. But again, this fear is being manufactured without any factual basis in terms of voters whose votes were pushed to a certain end. And this particular author goes on and on about things that happened in Wisconsin and other places without actually being able to say anyone's vote was affected by this fear that's being created. Another challenge to deterring mail voting is casting doubt on the third-party delivery of ballots, whether it's through the mail service, whether it's through drop boxes. In Colorado, a person can deliver up to 10 ballots for other people. And this becomes a tremendous bugaboo in the mail balloting process. There has never been shown any fraud in terms of this in-person process or the use of drop boxes. And look, we've all dealt with the mail and sometimes the vagaries of the mail for decades, which is why election officials basically say there's a time period beyond which you ought to use a drop box, or you ought to bring it into an election office. But that is a tactic that's used. More and more, we are seeing that there is an organized effort to basically infiltrate election process by people who don't believe that the process works. And that means they're getting involved as election judges or canvass board members or even staff members of city and county election officials. We haven't seen that play out yet, but it is a concern. And then there's the obvious, which we've all seen play out in the last 12 months, which is the demand for non-neutral audits of election results after an election occurs. That process dragged out in Arizona. It's gone on other places. There have been Colorado legislators who have demanded it. There was even a hearing in, I believe it was December after the 2020 election, where there were legislators that were demanding it in Colorado. Colorado has a very sophisticated election audit process, and I'm going to leave a discussion of that to Clerk Lopez and Judge Choate, because they're the ones that do it. But it validates, it reviews and validates the election process to ensure that the result is what people believe it to be. So I'm going to conclude there with one more thought. What can you do? What is there to do in light of the fact that my third confession, which is I lose sleep over whether or not we're going to maintain our system of government? What can you do? Well, I'm going to list a few things, and I'm hoping that Judd and Paul will amplify on them. You can become an election judge with your county clerk, so that there are people who are invested in fair elections, who are in a position to make judgment calls about signatures based on qualification and the like of individual ballots. Potentially get appointed to a canvass board. The canvass board is the entity that reviews precinct election results and validates them. You can be a source of informed, accurate, and reliable substantive information about how voting works in Colorado and share that in your circles. You have no idea how important that is. We all know the impact of social media and how that's adulterated, honestly, a lot of political debate. But good information is always the antidote. That means you need to be knowledgeable and you need to be willing to extend yourself. If those things don't resonate, figure out a state that hasn't got Colorado's secure voting system and go move there for a week or a month after you cast your mail ballot in Colorado and be part of voter protection efforts there. And finally, be aware of the legislative process and support legislation that protects the right to vote, and be willing to speak out against bills that use election integrity as a way of promoting fear about the process or the ways of undermining. So that's my message, and I'm going to stay on the line, obviously, for the question and answer period, but I'm going to turn it over to Judge Choate at this point, who's going to talk about what's going on across the country.
Hey, Mark, thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks for the invitation to come and speak. Let me tell you a little bit about myself real quick. So I'm the state election director. I've been the director for almost 13 years now, 12 or 13. When I was a first, baby lawyer, I wanted to be Mark Gruskin. That didn't work out, but I think I've got a job that rivals his. So it's worked out pretty well for me. My past work was I clerked for two different judges, Judge Tim Timkovich from the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals and Justice Alex Martinez of the Colorado Supreme Court. And then before that, I was a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska. I taught campaigns and elections. So I sort of bring a somewhat unusual perspective to this job that most elections directors don't have. They don't typically see it as a kind of a stats or sort of analytical driven kind of office. But let me dive into some of the issues that Mark sort of teed up for us. I will tell you straight out, though, that I hope that you ask questions so that I can tell you some of the nice things and good things about Colorado elections, because I'm about to sort of dive into the bad part of elections, and it's happening mostly in other states, but it is important for you all to know that you live in a state that does elections right and does it in a way that makes it as easy as possible and gives you every opportunity to register and to vote. That is not the design of other states' election models. And so it's very important that you understand that. I find it interesting. I talk to folks from other states. I testify in other states and legislatures and so forth. And people are always surprised that their state runs crappy elections. And I'm always a little sad to tell them that, but that's the way it goes. And it really is the case that they can make a lot of improvements. But that's not happening right now. In the last, I pulled up some numbers. There are 250 bills that have been filed already this year in 27 different states that would be, categorized reasonably as voter suppression bills. The current champion is Virginia. Virginia has 34 current bills to make significant changes to their vote model. So if you think about what's happened over the last couple of years is there was a real push prior to 2020 to change the way that people got their ballots because there was concern about COVID. A lot of that there's a retrenchment now. There's a lot of pulling back on some of those laws and policies. Virginia was a very aggressive state during that period. did a pretty much full change to their election model, so as to make it easier for their voters to vote during COVID. And they've had a governor change. My good friend, the elections director, just got fired for that state without cause. And that's what you can do in almost every state. By the way, just as a side note, I'm one of the very few elections directors in the country that is classified and thus can't be fired unless for cause. And for that reason, I've worked for 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and I haven't been fired across those 4 secretaries, although I almost did. But that was, we were able to sidestep that because the secretary at the time had to sort of understand state personnel policy and realize that he didn't have that power. But here I am, 4 secretaries later, and hypothetically, I'll be here for 4 more. That's certainly my plan. Other states that do not work that way. In my position in almost every other state, in fact, I can only name 1 other state where my position is not purely appointed. And so when you are in a purely appointed position, you serve at the luxury of the elected or appointed head of elections. And so my friends and colleagues in other states routinely get fired. And it's because there's turnover at the top, or the person does something that they don't like, and they have to leave office. So that just happened in Virginia. Very sad, because Chris Piper is his name, and he's a fantastic elections director, an amazing elections professional, but he's not going to be there anymore. Let me talk to you about some of these laws, these suppression laws that are happening around the country. So they sort of fall into a couple of different buckets. If you think about it, elections, there's really a 2-part process. First, you have to get registered, then you get a chance to vote. You cannot vote unless you're registered, unless you live in one state. Anybody want to guess what state that is? Mark, don't tell him. Anybody? It's North Dakota. North Dakota does not require you to register to vote. So if you live in North Dakota and have evidence that you live there and walk into a polling place on election day, they will hand you a ballot. They don't have a list that they refer to make sure that you live where you say you live and all that kind of stuff. So they're the only state in the country that's like, they're operating as the 14th Canadian province, because that's basically the way Canada does it. And I suspect that that's how they got that mode. But so there's registration, and then there's voting. There's actually not a lot of registration going on, suppression laws going on in the country. And part of that is because they've already been pretty successful on suppressing registration, and so there's really not a lot of there. But they're also very much focused on mode. They're focused on how you vote. So a lot of the suppression laws we're seeing are about limiting things like vote by mail. So let me go through some of these. These are laws that have been passed. So these are not laws that are teed up as potential laws. These are laws that have been passed and signed by a governor and will become law or have become law in their state. There are 5 states that have shortened the window to apply for mail ballot. Those are Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, New York, and Oklahoma. New York's the odd case there, and it's because it's a kind of a weird law that New York passed, where they limit the period of time that you can apply for a ballot, but they extended the early voting and in-person voting opportunities. So they sort of cut one off, but sort of gave with one hand and took away with the other. The other states, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, are some frequent flyers you'll see in this list that I'm about to do. There are a handful of other states that you'll hear a lot as well. It's also harder to remain on the ballot, on the mail ballot list now in Arizona and Florida. So they've taken away permanent mail-in voting. You might remember we had permanent mail-in voting before we had all mail. Well, Arizona and Florida, you now have limits on that. They limit the sending of mail ballot applications without a request. So this is the unsolicited mailings where either the state or the county or a nonprofit group might send out applications to all people registered to vote in a given jurisdiction and say, hey, you've got a chance to get your ballot by mail. Well, there are now Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, and Texas no longer permit that activity. Pretty sure that that's a violation of the First Amendment. So there will probably be, and probably is already, litigation going on that one, but that law is now in effect in several states. One of the things that Mark talked about was assistance for returning a mail ballot. So just as a sort of a side story on this, I work in the elections office. So I work at Secretary of State's office. I have 43 employees. We have a big office. We basically have a floor of this big office building. And around election day or in the days leading up to election day, it's not uncommon at all for somebody, one of our team members, to walk the hall and say, hey, I'm going to run over to Denver. I'm going to drop off some mail ballots. Anybody got their ballot that you want me to drop off? And they'll take 3 or 4 ballots over to the drop box that's out in front of the main Denver elections office. And that kind of behavior has been now outlawed in Arkansas, Florida, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Montana, and Texas. So you are the only person who can drop off your ballot in those states, with some very limited exceptions. There are also limits on drop boxes, so where they can be and how many you can have, those kinds of things. Those are new laws in Florida, Georgia, Iowa, and Indiana. Stricter signature requirements for mail ballots. So these are either instituting sort of specific methods by which you evaluate a signature, or requiring things in addition to a signature. So like your driver's license number, or your social security, last 4 years social security, or your full birth date, or something like that on the outside of an envelope. There are even states that require a notary. There's one state that requires 2 witnesses. So they make it in some of these states very difficult. These new laws are in Arizona, Idaho, Kansas, and Texas. There are voter ID restrictions. So this is the taking away of various voter IDs or IDs you can use to vote. Colorado, by the way, has 16 different IDs that we permit. It's pretty much the panoply of things that you might expect that you could use. It's all the kind of government issued kinds of materials. The most recent additions to those were tribal IDs. So we permit tribal IDs. Very few states permit tribal IDs, even though these are governments, and these are government issued IDs, which they have to be issued in a certain way, otherwise they can't be used for other purposes. And so we have great faith in those IDs, but in many jurisdictions, they're more and more restricting these IDs. So let's see, I've got Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Montana, New Hampshire, Texas, and Wyoming have all instituted new restrictions on voter ID. List maintenance. So list maintenance is somewhat more difficult to explain, but you all register to vote. And so when you register to vote, you go on to a list that we maintain, list maintenance, at the Secretary of State's office. The county then can make changes to that registration as warranted. And so let's say you go online and you make a change to your voter registration. Paul and his team are going to go and make an adjustment to that person's registration, maybe add a party, or delete a phone number, or if you move, change your address. All of those things are maintaining the list. Well, in several states, Arizona, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Texas, and Utah, they have made changes to the way that you maintain these lists. And most of these revolve around removal. So this is making it sort of cutting around the edges of what you can do under federal law to remove voters. I will say we're fortunate in this context that we have a federal law. It's called the National Voter Registration Act, which in some ways really is a great protection for removal. However, the US Supreme Court has taken a couple of recent opportunities to limit the National Voter Registration Act, and specifically Section 8, which is removal. And sort of, they've decided when there are two competing elements of Section 8, and there are lots of competing elements of Section 8 of the MVRA, when those two competing elements can't be sort of rationalized in the law, they go for cutting. So they go for canceling voters. The last two major decisions, the most important one was one called Husted versus A. Randolph, the A. Randolph Institute. Those two, that particular case really took a meat cleaver to the MVRA Section 8. So that was disappointing, but so some of these states are now instituting policies which build on that Husted decision. There are 3 states, interestingly, who have created barriers to voters with disabilities. So these are Alabama, Iowa, and Texas. These are laws that restrict the electronic return of ballots for those who have disabilities. And by the way, those who are in the military and overseas. So these are sort of commonly growing laws that we're seeing around the country. Colorado, by the way, allows for electronic return for people who are in military and overseas, also people who are have a disability, or people who are outside of the state due to an emergency. And now we're adding, or one interpretation of our current law that we've tried to expand as much as possible is for people who have personal emergencies. So something like you lost your home in a fire, which is very relevant to many people in Colorado. You also have the ability to vote in emergency manner. So there are a number of ways we're trying to expand that. Other states are contracting. There are restrictions on comfort teams. So this is what Mark was talking about with the pizza and the water and the shade. Florida and Georgia have eliminated all comfort team provisions in the law. So if you're in line for 3 hours in Georgia, you're kind of in line for 3 hours. You don't get a slice of pizza. You don't. Nobody can walk by and hand you a bottle of water. You just get to hang out in line. There are some states that have instituted restrictions on voter registration. So these are sort of more recent versions of what I'm describing. We've had one state that's lengthened the time in which you can register to vote, or lengthen the time prior to the election where the cutoff is. But this is pretty unusual activity. Usually we're going the other way. Colorado, by the way, moved from 29 days in 2013 to same-day registration in the November 2013 election. And I can tell you that in the entire time that we've had same-day registration, I can count on one hand the number of problems we've had related to same-day registration. It's easily accomplished. It's just you have to have the will and the interest in wanting to do it. There are a number of states that have reduced the number of polling places by law. Iowa, Montana, Texas. There's a subtlety to this. Some of these states are moving to vote centers. And so vote centers, you don't need nearly as many. So if you are moving to vote centers and simultaneously limiting polling places, that's something we can all live with. But in some of these examples, I'm not sure that that's what's happening. I'm 100% sure it's not happening in Texas. And then lastly, the limit on early voting. So Georgia, Iowa, and Texas have all limited early voting either in scope or time or location or number. So there's all sorts of ways that you can limit early voting in that manner. So those are some types of suppression laws that are happening right now. Those are already in effect. And I just wanted to make one note. So I watched the All In documentary prior to this, and I think I had actually seen it, or at least seen major parts of it prior to that. But I watched it yesterday, and I just one thing I just wanted to note for you. While I totally agree that the diminution of the Voting Rights Act was a bad idea, the rewriting or basically throwing out of Section 4, which meant that Section 5 no longer applied, and pre-clearance went away. So this is where laws in states with histories of voter suppression had to be pre-cleared, had to be reviewed by the Department of Justice prior to the election, prior to its use. That was a bad idea. And I think that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was right. It's like, putting your umbrella away when you're in the rain. But I will say, here's an interesting way to look at that. If Section 4 had still been live in 2020, that meant Section 5 would still be live in 2020, which would have meant that all of those jurisdictions which were making changes in the 2020 election cycle because of COVID, if you were a qualified state, if you were a state that was subject to preclearance, you would have had to run those changes through the Trump Department of Justice to make those changes. And I'm just guessing, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just guessing the Department of Justice would not have accepted many of those changes. And so changes made in Georgia, Arizona, Virginia, and other states where the outcome probably wasn't changed, like Alaska, I bet you that those changes had effect on the turnout and who won those elections. So ironically, Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority in Shelby, may very well have, that decision may very well have put us in a better position for the 2020 election, because we, instead of fighting over a couple of states, which we probably would have, Trump lost 6 states. And so by losing 6 states, it's a much harder argument than 2 or 3. So anyway, just one thing to think about. It's often the case that when a law gets changed or a law gets passed and people fight against it, they often find themselves a year, 10 years, 20 years later saying, actually, that worked out okay for us. and there's examples of that. I agree that the Voting Rights Act should not have been changed, and we should reinstitute some version of Section 4. But it might have worked out in 2020, because otherwise I think Arizona and Georgia probably go to Donald Trump because of their failure to get their policies through the Department of Justice. And then we have a fight over 3 or 4 states instead of 6. Anyway, just as an aside, I thought that was kind of a humorous aside. I think I'm handing it over to Paul now.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Well, I really appreciate it. I mean, it's hard to go after, this is kind of like the, like a really good concert, except you have all the headliners first, right? So, no, I'm honored to participate in this. Thank you for the invitation. Judd is an amazing state director, and part of the great thing about Colorado is that the model that you have before you, and we always talk about this voting model, but it's the same in 64 counties. So we don't have a sandbox fight in every single county. I can't say that about every other state, right? So it's a good balance, and it strikes a good chord with, what was 1303 and some of these, laws that had passed. It kind of set the stage for best practices throughout every one of our 64 counties. So, things from like the accuracy test in the beginning to the audit at the end, the canvas to, a lot of the rules that we all abide by are universal and similar in every single one of our counties. Now, do we use different equipment in some cases? Do we use different systems? Absolutely. But the rules of the game are the same, and the playing field is level. And that is what makes a secure and not just viable, but a trusted governance of our elections. I'm also in awe because I get to share this panel with you all, but also Mark Ruskin. I've known Mark Ruskin since I was a labor organizer. I started out, I'm born and raised in Denver. And Judd, you're right. I think, we all look at Mark Ruskin as that leader, and Mr. Gruskin, I didn't get to know him right away, but I knew the voice. And when I heard that voice, the Mark Gruskin voice, I was like, "That's the Rockies announcer here? Is it the Rockies announcer?" Or you could, I think that's the dude from the Broncos. Like, oh my God, right? Because he just has that presence. But Mr. Gruskin, there's a lot of the debt we owe to people like Mr. Gruskin, who definitely care about our democracy and the state of our democracy, and has done a lot of work, in our communities, working with our organizations to make sure that we all have that level playing field that we talked about with those same set of rules. Now, I was born and raised in Denver, in the West Side. My family comes from northern Colorado and northern New Mexico, and my father actually comes from Mexico. So we have a lot of roots here, and in seeing, how elections have been run since I've been paying attention since I was 13 years old, and I was doing voter registration on doors in my community. I fell in love with it, right? So being able to effectuate change and being able to be a part of that, in my office, I was elected 2 years ago. I was a city councilman for 12 years, serving on the west side of Denver. I was 28 years old when I was elected. I feel like Jermaine Jackson. I feel like my whole childhood. Like, I feel one of the Jacksons. Like, my whole childhood is gone. Like, it was, the times where I could be, walk down Larimer and just gone, right? Trinity, you're laughing because it's true. But I've dedicated it. Like, I love this, right? This is the kind of work that we all have signed up for, and this is the kind of work that we believe in. I could tell you, in all honesty, I've never had a more difficult time as an elected official than in the last 2 years, right? And especially because I've really, out of all the crazy things that we've all had to go through politically, I never thought that the undermining of a democratic institution and election would come from the White House. I'd never thought that as an elections official, people would threaten us. They would try to intimidate us. I heard about this kind of stuff in war-torn countries where you have civil war, where they literally line up a tank next to the polling place, or they have soldiers and they sit there and intimidate you. Nobody would think that was Arapahoe County, right? Nobody would think that this would be in our own backyard, but it is, and it's saddening, right? My job as a county clerk is to not pick sides. I don't pick sides. I don't care how you vote. I don't care who you vote for. Well, deep down inside, kind of do, but I don't have the ability to be involved in that, and I don't, because we want to. The system and the model in which we operate is trusted, and that's the number one factor in all of this. Is it trusted? And when you have folks who try to erode that public trust, that's the largest detriment. That's the biggest threat to our democracy right now, is the erosion of public trust. This sleight of hand saying, oh, there's a lot of cheating going on here. Oh, there's a lot of fraud. And then you have folks who all they do is pay attention to this little thing. And whatever's on that Facebook post, they'll believe, they'll retweet it. And that's the research. And it's kind of serendipitous that there's a pandemic going on around this, because the same kind of false narrative on the pandemic is the same kind of false narrative you see with elections, right? Oh, they must be doing something with those Dominion machines. They must be counting backwards, or there's an internet connection somewhere. Let me just find it. Let me get in there and find it, Mr. Clerk. Or you know what? There has to be a microchip in that vaccine that you got, right? And it's amazing just at the level of belief that some people have in it. But it's also, we got to pay attention. It's also a very small percentage of the population that have access to all this media. The majority of folks out there know that our democracy is safe, know that it's trusted. I mentioned, some of these other areas. I had the opportunity to be in Venezuela as an international observer when they were having their second Hugo Chavez election when he was trying to stay in office. And watching that take place and looking at the different tactics that were going on, you literally had folks walk around with machetes, right? You literally had this polarization where there had been coups d'etats, and there were these tactics that were geared to try to intimidate people. I never thought ever that I would see this happen in our own country, that I'd hear about this kind of stuff in our own country, to see those kind of tactics to the point where they try to intimidate the election workers. Now, I know it sounds a little out there when I say this, and I wish it was just a hyperbole, but it's not. On the 2nd of February, that's what month we're in, we get these notices, and I stood with other elected officials and our Secretary of State, Jenna Griswold, because one of the things that's happening is you're starting to see a lot more of this, and I got to tell you, there was this rattled me, and it rattled me more than ever, because you think that we'd be through it all. You think that with all the evidence out there, or lack thereof, with all the examples of how this system works, and there is no fraud, that people would cool down about it. But we get these once in a while, these warnings, and this one comes from the National Terrorism Advisory System, and it's part of it's a bulletin. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security. Right? It has nothing to do with Ukraine, has nothing to do with anything that's happening around the world. It's here. And here's, one of the most highlighting, parts of this is that they say, quote unquote, some domestic violent terror extremists have continued to advocate for violence in response to false or misleading narratives about unsubstantiated election fraud. The months preceding the upcoming 2022 elections, the midterm elections, could provide additional opportunities for these extremists and other individuals to call for violence directed at democratic institutions, political candidates, party offices, which we've seen, people throwing bricks and stuff at offices, but also election events and election workers. Ladies and gentlemen, these are our fellow citizens. Election workers, poll workers. We ask for participation from election judges. These are citizens, these are Republicans and Democrats, these are unaffiliated folks, these are our family members. These are high school kids, some of them, right? I mean, these are our elders, some of them on oxygen. And here we are trying to protect them by making sure that we have masks and PPE and spacing them out, and surviving a pandemic. And here yet we have these threats, right? So these are one of many different kind of threats. I mean, there were folks that came into my building not too long ago asking where I sat and didn't want their bags checked. I've had to move my offices from the first floor of the web to the second floor in the elections building. Now, when people say, have you received threats? The elections officials have received threats in this state. They've received you see that they received threats across the country. I say no. When they ask me personally, you know why? Because when they see that they got to you, they win. Terrorism is at its very root of the word, meant to terrorize you, meant to keep you from acting in a way that fulfills the duties that you've taken your oath to do. I've had threats as a councilman, but if you get up there and say, I was threatened, then you know what? I think it's important for the public to know that these happen, but you let them win. And the answer isn't more cops. The answer isn't more patrols. The answer is you all participated. All of us participated. All of us validating this elections model and participating in and defending the democracy like that. All of us is being able to counter that, not just by your participation, but by your help and by your example. I use this. I didn't get to serve in the armed services. I really wanted to. My grandfather he's a World War II veteran. my elders had served proudly. And I think of especially the example of World War II, right? Defending the democracy. You know, folks who have enlisted to defend our democracy abroad. If all we're going to do is let it erode here. Putting their lives and everything at risk to defend our democracy. If all we're going to do is just hand it over to a bunch of bullies who literally are probably in tidy whities in their mother's basements on a Zoom call or on Facebook trying to threaten us. I mean, I'm not wearing tidy white, real jeans and flannel, but you know what I'm saying? I think a lot of it, and I'm being lighthearted about this, but I'm also being serious about this. Yes, we get those threats. Yes, it's really hard to recruit. And what it does is seek to undermine the democracy. But the biggest thing, what you're seeing throughout these conversations is there's also a concerted effort to discredit what we do, but to undermine public confidence and to erode public confidence in what we do. And when that is eroded, that's when our safety is at risk. That's when the safety and those pillars of democracy are cracked, right? And that depends on all of us. And so, participation, absolutely. Defending the democracy, you ain't got to suit up. You also don't have to, do what was done, the sacrifice to protect our democracy in the streets of this country for decades. Being shot, being beaten, being sprayed, right? Being humiliated. It's incumbent upon us to defend the democracy simply by participating. That's all we're asking you to do. That's all we're asking people to do. Participate. Turn that ballot in early. Don't wait. And in Colorado, we're a glaring example of how it works because we don't. And you have 23 days to be able to study your ballot and drop it off at a Dropbox, put it in the mail. Well, I wouldn't put it in the mail at the 23rd day, but or come into one of our vote centers, right? Turn those ballots in early. One of the best examples in Judd, Mark, you remember this, the primary in 2020, it was a moving target because people were just shifting all over the place, right? 99% of people didn't vote in person. 1% did. Everybody else submitted that ballot. In the general, that was 94%. That's remarkable. So we're asking it's going to continue. And this coordinated, it wasn't so. And the coordinated, a lot of folks were voting, last minute. When you're in line and you create lines and you're voting last minute, that's when there's physical risk, right? One, because of COVID, obviously, because we're still in a pandemic, but two, because you have people congregating. So anyway, I don't want to take up too much time because I know there's opportunities for questions, but as an elections administrator, as a clerk and recorder, we take this job, with the utmost respect and love because we represent you, but also because we want to continue to prove that when it's ran by the public and not by parties, it's a great elections model. And the one thing I got to say, there's the other part of our office and my administration is we created this community outreach approach where we have an engagement team that's going out in every single nook and cranny of the city and just having these kind of conversations. And sometimes they have to happen in person. And let me give you an example along East Colfax is one of our some of our precincts with the lowest propensity of voters out there, we discovered are folks who are from Burma, who are from parts of Ethiopia and parts of areas that are war torn, right? And when we go around with voter registration, our office goes and does voter registration in these areas, they don't want to register to vote. Ask why? Why don't you want to register to vote? Fellow citizens, come on, right? People cross deserts to come over here and become citizens, have a better opportunity at life, and then they go through the process to vote. And it's one of the most beautiful things when you see them actually do it. But why wouldn't you want to vote? And they say, you know why? Because y'all know y'all know how we're gonna vote. And I said, what makes you think that? Well, back in our country, you register to vote, you vote. That's ran by the parties. It's not a trusted system out there. And then you go missing. And when I explained to them, well, in our process, you vote your mail ballot. The only thing that has your name is the envelope. And in our process, right after your signature scan, we know that it's you, that envelope, and that ballot never see each other again. It's like a Kim Kardashian wedding, like quick, boom, gone, you know? And then it goes through that process. We value voter anonymity. And when you have that conversation with them and they understand that process and they can see it and you walk it through them, trust is established. But it has to happen sometimes on a one-on-one basis in person with communities. And that's the nooks and crannies. Think about that, how that affects generations of voters, right? So it's creating a culture of participation. The best way we can defend this democracy through a culture of participation is universal.
Gentlemen, you have been absolutely incredible. Thank you so much, not only for being here today, but for bringing us your individual expertise and for all the work that you do to make Colorado one of the most trustworthy places to vote in the nation, and for everything that you do for that every day. I do want to acknowledge the fact that First Plymouth typically allows an hour for these adult forums. And so if people need to leave or have other obligations, feel free to do so. But I do want to allow a question or two if someone has something burning and really would love something to get answered before we take off. But if not, that's absolutely fine as well. But I want to give the opportunity to anyone who has a question, if anyone does.
I have a question to any of the three gentlemen. What can I do in the state of Colorado to advance the protection of voting rights in states in which state legislatures are trying to limit those voting rights?
Well, okay, my 2 cents on this is, where do bad policies come from? They come from bad policymakers, and bad policymakers are elected every day. And the way that you in a state where this is seemingly not as big a problem could sort of affect that is in some of the ways that Mark mentioned, either joining call banks that call up voters in other states, donating to good causes that try to promote democratic policies around the country, or even going to another state and canvass on behalf of this different state. So there are various things you can do. They're a little harder than being in your state. For those of you that are interested in what you can do in your state, be very careful about trying to understand candidates and their histories. Right now, this fall election my boss is up for re-election, Jenna Griswold. There's a couple of Republicans who have announced. One of those is Tina Peters, who's the county clerk in Mesa County, who is sort of at the point of the spear on some of the more fantastical elections integrity claims. She should not be in this position. She shouldn't be in her current position. So she should not be Secretary of State. And so, doing what you can to make sure she doesn't get to that position would be really important. I can't vote there. And obviously we run a fair elections in Colorado, so it's not like we can do anything about it. Other than the voters of the state of Colorado can, make sure that she doesn't become county clerk or doesn't become more than county clerk and become secretary of state. So those are the kinds of things you need to be watching out for. There are also, bad laws that, bad bills that get promoted. There's a bill right now at the legislature that would eliminate mail ballot, eliminate early voting, make no votes cast on electronic voting machines, all ballots be counted by hand. That's a bill that's under consideration right now. It's going to lose, but those bills happen, and so you need to be aware of them. And if you see one of those coming up, call your legislator, call your senator, go and testify and tell them this is a bad idea. So those are some things you can do.
Mr. Gruskin, Mr. Lopez, do either of you have anything to add to that?
I think Judge stated it well. In terms of what goes on in other states, honestly, if we could will it so, we would be able to ensure those other states don't modify their laws so that fewer voters can vote and fewer voters can vote easily, even though they're qualified. To Judd's point, Colorado, as good as it is, and it is, it's, I'm not kidding when I say it's the national model, as good as we are at protecting that fundamental right. There's no, the courts acknowledge it, and we sometimes overlook it, but it is a fundamental right of every qualified Coloradan to cast a vote. We've got to be careful in Colorado that our system stays where it is, that there isn't problematic state legislation, and that there aren't local election officials who think that they have the purview to take our extraordinary system and put it into the national political dialogue for their own political purposes. So I guess I'd tell you, unfortunately, we've still got work to do here in Colorado to protect all the gains that we've made. Once it comes to the actual election season, I think there are a lot of things that you can do to help people vote in other states. And there are good nonpartisan groups like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, that can facilitate your efforts.
To that is just, like I said earlier, participate. Make sure you participate. Make sure you hold electeds accountable. I served on a legislative branch in the Denver City Council for 12 years, and those emails, I read them, right? Those kind of things, those kind of communications, like, they matter. You matter. Your input matters. But here's the other thing too. Whatever you do as a professional, whatever you are great at, do it. But also interject those values of defending the democracy and what you expect in what you do. If you're a muralist, put a mural out there that says vote, right? If you are, a mathematician, try to, help everybody else that flunked math understand it, right? In terms of why it doesn't make sense. And when people say that there's fraud and it's zero, but it's 0.0006, there is fraud. That's almost statistically zero. And the ones that have actually committed it, when you find out where they're from and what their affiliation was from and where, they don't want to hear it, right? All of a sudden, it's a non-issue. Oh, that one was just crazy. And I think, it's help set the record straight, help set that democracy, help defend the democracy by doing what you do best, with a new theme, right? And that background theme is defending what we have in this country. Because I tell you, I'm willing to go to the streets for it. right? What did he say? Out of my cold dead hands, right? You don't have to do that. We don't have to get to that point.
Absolutely. And I also just saw Susan just posted in the chat that we have to also, for anyone looking to consider looking up Vote Forward and sort of do some research on that and see how you can get involved that way as well. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Do you mind if I show you something? I assume most of you can see a screen.
Yeah.
I just want to show you, this is where Colorado ranks nationally. So this shows each federal election since 2000 and how we compared to the national average. So in 2000, we were basically the average. We were slightly above the average. But since then, through a number of very good policies, and I think, really good people running elections, Mark had a lot to do with this, by the way. He failed to mention that earlier, but you can see that we have gradually grown against the national average to the point where now we're routinely 10 plus points above the national average, even when the national average goes up. So the turnout percentage in this last election was very high. So you have a lot to be proud of in Colorado. There's a lot of really good things. And by the way, Colorado is a much more diverse state than most of the other states that do really well in turnout elections. I can show you, this is how Colorado, that's the big green line, ranks against other states that do really well in turnout. And look at what those other states are. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Maine, Oregon, these are not especially diverse states. The more diverse states tend to not do nearly as well. But Colorado does, even though there are various barriers that make voting harder for more diverse and socioeconomically challenged populations. So if you create a good model and you give people an opportunity to register and you get ballots in their hands, they're going to vote. And so, be proud of the fact that you're in Colorado. When you're talking to other people in other states, tell them about your system. And I think people, that resonates with people. They understand, and it makes them want to have a better system in their state. Anyway, I wanted to end on some good news.
No, actually, that was extremely helpful. I'm a visual person, so I appreciate any graphics that anyone can provide ever. Gentlemen, it has been an absolute honor. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your expertise and your continuous work. If no one else has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is it for today, but we sincerely appreciate your time, and get out and vote. Go register to vote. Make people register to vote. You guys have been amazing. Thank you so much for everything. Have a wonderful Sunday, and we will hopefully be in contact